Christian, thank you for coming on to the show.
It's my pleasure, Jacob. It's a privilege to be here.
So, Christian, you had a very stimulating essay in Foreign Policy on their website about Russia. Now, we've heard a lot about Russia being stymied in Ukraine, about its increasing hybrid warfare on NATO's eastern flank, but you zeroed in on something else, namely a country that Russia has serially attacked, first under Boris Yeltsin, then under Vladimir Putin, twice, I believe. And that country is, of course, Chechnya, which is undergoing perhaps a leadership transition. But in your article, you suggested that Chechnya could be another, or could be an Achilles heel for Putin. Can you tell us why you think that's the case?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jacob. The answer is very simple. The leader of Chechnya, a guy named Ramzan Kadyrov, is dying. It's very clear that he's severely ill, and he's been making preparations to ensure his succession and ensure that his family is safe when he passes away. But the problem is Chechnya is a famously unstable place. So when he goes, there could be serious chaos there. There's a long history of turmoil and rebellion there. When Ramzan Kadyrov's father came to power, they managed to put an end to that.
What was his father's name and when did he come to power?
Yeah, his father's name was Ahmad Kadyrov, and he came to power in 2000, I believe, during the second, what we call now the Second Chechen War, which was underway at the time. His father was a sort of consensus figure who was a very important religious figure in Chechnya and managed to quiet things down.
Now, you actually went in with Russian troops at that time in 2000 as a correspondent for Newsweek?
I did. I also went in 2003, again with Russian troops, and interviewed the father when he had become president of Chechnya. And that was very illuminating, but it all felt very tentative and unstable. Because that's the kind of place it is. It's about the size of Connecticut, but it wields an outsized influence on Russian politics. And Putin only managed to quiet the situation down by installing this family in power. And Ramzan, the son, who's been in power now for, I think, almost 25 years, no, more like 20 years, he has done so by installing a North Korean-style regime of dictatorship, which has kind of tamped everything down. But as soon as he goes, all bets are off. And the last thing Vladimir Putin needs right now is a bleeding ulcer in the heart of Russia when he's trying to subdue Ukraine.
Now, why are all bets off?
All bets are off because the Chechens have such a notorious history of fractionalism, and Ramzan Kadyrov has earned this stability by both marriage politics with other clans, but also by brutally suppressing his enemies. And that's included hunting them down overseas and killing them. And Chechnya, it's kind of like the Sicily of Russia, right? They have a long organized crime tradition, and they have these very serious blood feud traditions. So over 20 years of dictatorship, Ramzan Kadyrov has built up like a Fort Knox worth of blood feuds among his enemies. And as soon as he's gone, they'll have a chance to take revenge. Not to mention seizing power. I mean, there are a lot of candidates waiting in the wings. So one can assume that Vladimir Putin has a team of people urgently trying to figure out how to keep this thing under control when the lid blows.
So you see the danger of a return to civil war in Chechnya?
Yes, very much so. And the Ukrainians have been very artfully stirring the pot. The Ukrainian parliament basically recognized Chechnya as an independent nation a few years ago. And they've welcomed a lot of Chechens who are fighting on the Ukrainian side against the Russians. There are also Chechens, just to make things even more complicated, there are also Chechens fighting on the Russian side, right? Because Kadyrov is a strong Putin loyalist. But there are plenty of Chechens fighting on the Ukrainian side, and the Ukrainians are supplying them with all kinds of delightful weapons. And the Ukrainians, knowing Russia intimately as they do, that's a big part of this whole story, right? They're doing everything they can to make Chechnya as turbulent as possible when Kadyrov goes.
Now, Chechnya has been a source of friction for the Russian Empire as well, has it not?
Indeed, in the 1860s, when Russia was conquering that part of the world, the Chechens put up a very, very harsh and persistent resistance that was fueled with a kind of Islamic holy war. And famously, Tolstoy wrote a whole beautiful novella about the war to suppress the Chechens. He kind of admired, it was sort of like American romantics who admired the Native Americans. He admired their spirit of resistance, their ability to fight against overwhelming odds. And it's a tiny place, but they have this history of just really persistently battling outsized enemies.
When you look at Kadyrov, why do you think he's not that old? What is he dying of? Do we know?
We're not sure. One of the diagnoses is that he's dying of pancreatic disease, terminal pancreatic disease. There are other reports that he's been on dialysis, so it sounds like he has some failing kidneys, something in that general vicinity of the body. But he has sought treatment. He's been treated in Moscow. He has his own, very, very well-equipped hospital because he has a lot of money to work with. And he's apparently also sought treatment in the United Arab Emirates, where he's also been parking a lot of money and preparing his family for a possible, refuge after he goes.
Even by the standards of the region, Kadyrov has been a remarkably brutal leader, has he not?
That is very true. He's been sanctioned by the European Union, the UK, the United States, in particular for his savage policies against LGBT people. He styles himself as an Islamic fundamentalist, so he has very, very harsh views about that particular issue. He's also, as I mentioned earlier, he's been known to hunt down his opponents overseas and in other parts of Russia. He was behind the assassination of one of his main rivals in a Dubai parking garage. I believe it was in 2008. So if you disagree with him, he will hunt you down and kill you.
How does his Islamic fundamentalism manifest itself?
Well, he has instituted a Sharia regime in his republic, which is a marvelous indictment of all of these people who try to portray Russia as a defender of traditional Christian values. They seem to completely ignore the fact that Putin has allowed this guy to establish a Saudi-style, religious dictatorship in the middle of Russia. So he has allowed marriage, polygamy officially in the Republic, very, very tough Sharia laws. And intriguingly, he's also cultivated all sorts of relationships to Islamic leaders in the rest of the world, particularly to the ruler in the United Arab Emirates, with whom he has cultivated a very close friendship. So he's embarked on a very expansive program of mosque building in Chechnya, spent enormous amounts of money on Islamic charities in various parts of the Muslim world. So he's really tried to profile himself as an exemplary Muslim leader.
Is he connected to the Muslim Brotherhood as well?
I don't think so. I don't think that's something he's been willing to do because some of those Islamist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, were very closely associated with the rebellion against Russia in the 1990s in Chechnya. And Putin really, really cracked down on them very, very hard. So I don't think he would dare to associate himself with those groups. Instead, he's associated himself with established Islamic leaders in the Muslim world. That would be going a step too far, I suspect.
Vladimir Putin originally consolidated his power by alleging that Chechens had bombed an apartment building in Moscow. Isn't that really the foundation stone of Putin's own dictatorship in Russia?
Absolutely. It was several buildings in Moscow and a building and other terrorist attacks as well. There's a lot of doubt, very well-founded doubt, as to whether the Chechens were actually behind those attacks. They may have been false flag attacks to create a pretext for intervention in Chechnya. But of course, once the Second Chechen War really got underway, the Chechens did verifiably stage some serious terrorist attacks in Russia, which probably, ended up probably overplaying their hand somewhat. but yes, it was Vladimir Putin who famously said, "We'll find them and we'll kill them in the shitter if we have to," which was the kind of very tough talk that Russians loved at the time, and which was directed specifically against Chechen terrorists. He made his career as a brutal, with his brutal crackdown on the Chechens. That's how he made his reputation. That's how he became Russian president. So this is no small matter. The Chechen issue is the very heart of his identity as a Russian strongman.
Well, let's turn this subject now to Ukraine, which has become perhaps as or even more fundamental to Putin's identity. He has embarked upon this war, which he thought would reunite Ukraine with Mother Russia. In fact, it appears to have boomeranged. And now it appears that the Ukrainians have the upper hand. Is that your assessment?
That is my assessment. The Ukrainians have really staged an extraordinary turnaround. I mean, Russia outnumbers them in resources and population to a dramatic degree. It's really extraordinary, what a mismatch there is in this conflict. And yet in recent months, Ukraine has actually managed to win territory back from the Russians. The Russians are now net losers of territory. Not a huge amount, but that's still a very, very striking fact. A Russian military blogger, one of these kind of tolerated critics of the war from the right in Russia, has recently come out with the assessment that the Ukrainians now have 70 drones for every Russian soldier on the front line. That is an extraordinary statistic coming from the Russians, yeah? It's now estimated that the Ukrainians are killing more Russians. In April, I believe it was 30,000, than Russia can recruit each month. So there is now a net loss trend among Russian manpower. And that is absolutely extraordinary, right? The most dramatic thing, of course, is that Ukraine has now developed its own drone alternatives that to some Western weapons that enable it to strike mid-range and also deep inside Russia. You remember when we gave the Ukrainians the HIMARS, medium-range rocket launching system? That was absolutely devastating for the Russians, but they gradually figured out ways to neutralize the threat. Well, guess what? The Ukrainians then developed drones that could do the same thing at the same distances. And they are now using an extended campaign of those drones to cut Russia off from its own forces in Crimea. What's more, they've even developed long-range drones that are striking thousands of miles inside Russia, oil refineries, ports, petrochemical plants. And they're not just striking at these, immediate close-up military targets. They're hitting strategic military industrial targets like oil refineries. And they're not just blowing up storage tanks. They're blowing up key infrastructure that is really hard to repair. So this is becoming a serious strategic threat to Putin at a very fundamental level. I was just watching some video reports that came out of Russia from, Russians blogging on their phones and getting the stuff out through VPNs, where, they were saying, look at this gas line. This gas line goes on forever. And now I'm hearing air raid sirens. What the hell is happening? Was the world coming to an end? That was one of the clips I saw. So the Ukrainians are bringing the war home to the Russians to an extraordinary degree. It's really incredible to watch.
How long do you think Russia can sustain this kind of economic damage?
I think they can sustain it for a while yet, but they really have to start thinking hard about how to sustain it. Putin just held this high-profile economic conference in St. Petersburg, and one of the notable absences was his central bank chairperson, Elvira Naibulina. She is one of the people credited with keeping the Russian economy afloat amid all of these difficulties, and she was just not there, which was kind of a striking signal because the finance minister recently warned Putin that the fiscal deficit in Russia is spiking, the oligarchs are clearly becoming very restive. Oil exports are dramatically down. The Europeans are cranking up sanctions. And it's not a pretty situation for Russia.
There's increasing talk that Putin's own position could be jeopardized inside this system that he's created.
Yes.
Is that a serious possibility, or is the wish the father of the thought?
It's very hard to assess from the outside, of course, just what sort of threat, how strong that threat is. I think there is a threat. It is striking that we consistently see reports of high-ranking Russians mysteriously falling out of windows.
There was one just yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. Why are members of the Russian elite, losing their lives in such conspicuous ways? And of course, the most obvious assumption is he needs to intimidate the people who are still there, right?
What would be
he's clearly afraid of something. Right. It's very hard to know how serious the threat is. My own sense is it's not perhaps as immediate as some people are depicting it. But, I lived through the collapse of the dictatorship in East Germany in 1989. They had the highest number of secret police informers of any society in the world. That government was the most buttoned down repressive government in the world at the time. No one thought it could crack. But then one day it did.
What would Putin be able at this point, if he chose, to launch a 1936-style Great Purge inside Russia?
He certainly could do it if he wanted to. Stalin did that at the moment of tremendous peril to the Soviet Union. It wasn't exactly a rational choice at the time. To do that during a major war with a nearby adversary seems crazy. But who knows what kind of scenarios.
But if he was intent on terrorizing the population into submission and eradicating what he viewed as disloyal opposition, I've even read that some people are speculating that he has sort of a binary choice, either to loosen up and try and allow the economy to flourish a little bit, or to launch a massive crackdown.
He certainly could try to launch a massive crackdown. And as you note, there are people within the country who are advocating something like that. One thing he has done is to crack down on the internet, right? He's now almost completely severed the Russian internet from the outside world. And Russians are crying bloody murder over that because a lot of them were, commercially dependent on using the internet. They relied on it. They relied on YouTube for advertising and for all sorts of things. And there's been a tremendous outcry, both from ordinary Russians and from high-ranking people in the business community. I think that's his compromise on the issue that you're talking about. Launching a Stalin-style purge seems quite risky, but I don't think he feels like he has the room to loosen up either.
Let's look at Russia's foreign policy situation right now. It's actually more dire than it was several years ago, isn't it? Syria, Assad was toppled. Cuba is being menaced by the United States, or from his perspective. Venezuela, Trump liberated it. Viktor Orban, his key Trojan horse inside the EU, toppled from power. Is the Russian, from the perspective of Putin, has he really taken a hit?
I think he has taken a hit.
I forgot to mention Iran, which is also a key, maybe ally is too strong, but certainly they have a very warm relationship.
Well, that's an excellent point, Jacob. I think he is in rather dire straits internationally. To me, the really striking moment was his recent visit to China. China is now Russia's major ally, its major patron. I really would have to define the relationship that way, too, because, it used to be that they were kind of partners on an equal footing. Now Xi Jinping treats Putin really as a junior partner. Putin went to China with a major request. He wants to expand a pipeline network that already exists to China so he can send China more oil and natural gas, and China didn't bite. China just didn't feel like it. They didn't accede to his request. And in general, the treatment of Putin during that visit was quite aloof. And that was very striking, because I think even the Chinese can see how his international stature has been diminished by all these things that have been happening. It's also very striking that the great Russia lover, Donald J. Trump, has now kind of expressed his apathy towards the whole situation between Ukraine and Russia. Marco Rubio has essentially washed his hands of the Ukrainian peace process.
Rubio has actually been very critical of Russia in the past couple of weeks on Ukraine, saying they can't win the war.
Exactly.
And do you think Trump smells a loser in Putin now?
I think so. I think the sheen is off. Definitely, that's the way it feels at the moment. Yeah. And Europeans have gotten a bit of a spine. I wouldn't say that they've still completely stepped up, but they have recently managed to launch this new package of sanctions, which is very striking. So they're also not treating Putin as kind of this monolithic, threatening figure that he used to be.
It's very interesting because Europe has pretty much emancipated itself from Russian energy sources, hasn't it?
It really has. It's been a striking transformation. I mean, it's still in progress, right? You don't do that sort of thing overnight, but the extent that they have managed to liberate themselves from Russian energy resources is really pretty astonishing. People tend to forget also that the United States is the biggest petroleum superpower in the world today, and we've really, been picking up some of the slack. The Europeans have managed to find a lot of other sources for energy. And of course, they're also boosting renewables and nuclear power. So, Russia has this tendency, you can see it with, Finland and Sweden joining NATO after the invasion of Ukraine. Russia has this extraordinary tendency to harm itself with its actions, right?
Do you think Russia is headed for collapse as a unitary state?
I feel it's very early to say that, but certainly, it's always been a fragile state, and I think its fragility is becoming very apparent at the moment.
Let me ask you another question about Russia as we're delving into this.
Please.
There's a new biography of Richard Pipes by Jonathan Daly that has just appeared. And as we're talking about Russia, we began with Chechnya, and we're talking about the consistency of Russian behavior, from the 19th century in Chechnya and so forth. Now, Pipes's thesis was that Imperial Russia, was a patrimonial regime, and that it did in its own way follow a separate path, what the Germans would call a Sonderweg, from Europe. Do you think that Putin's attempt at reconstructing, maybe not the Soviet, but certainly the Russian Empire, by trying to, control Chechnya, by trying to occupy and conquer Ukraine, was Pipes onto something? Is this actually a Russian patrimonial tradition, strong state, weak civil society, that it just can't get under from?
Well, it certainly feels that way at the moment. The democratic interregnum in Russia didn't go well.
There have been two, and they've been truncated.
Well, exactly. But I was, of course, referring to the one that I personally experienced in the 1990s. And that was a huge mess, right? Democrats, quote unquote, Democrats got into power, liberal Democrats. People who were in favor of a pluralistic democratic society. And they turned out to be incredibly corrupt and inefficient and incompetent. And they made it really easy to replace them with a strongman alternative who could at least make sure that people's salaries got paid on time. Oil prices also didn't help. Oil prices were low at the time, and then when they bounced back, that helped Putin a lot. So I personally think that Pipes' thesis has a lot to say for it. There has over the years been a very strong westernizing tradition in Russia. That's no question. That certainly existed. But I've always been struck by, the number of Russians who have told me they don't really think that they're European. They think they're something else. They don't identify with Europe. They think of Europe as something sometimes to be admired, sometimes to be feared, but always as the other. I don't think Russians view themselves as Europeans. I think that's an idea that westernizing liberals in Russia have
tried
often
to graft onto the society.
Tried to graft onto the society. It doesn't really feel very authentic. In Ukraine, starting around the beginning of this century, we had an extraordinary civic renaissance, a real grassroots revival of society. And people in their own communities were mobilizing and becoming politically active. And we saw that in the great political movements like the Euromaidan in 2013 and 14, when people came out in the streets to demand a European future for Ukraine and to reject Russian domination of Ukraine. And it is that tradition which has actually fueled this successful resistance to the Russians. We all talk about the gadgets, right? The amazing equipment that the Ukrainians have devised, and that is an incredible achievement. What people don't seem to get is that is the outgrowth of this decentralized, anti-hierarchical system that the Ukrainians have developed over the years, right? It starts with mothers' organizations making camouflage nets in their living rooms, and it is now translated into hundreds, if not thousands, of little defense tech companies scattered all over the country. The Russians can't even bomb them because, they're in a warehouse in some, deserted place. The Russians can't even find all these places, So that has all contributed to this extraordinary flowering of Ukrainian innovation. Very anti-hierarchical, very anti-bureaucratic. Information comes back from the front. Somebody in Ukraine develops a response. Absolutely amazing.
Which is, of course, precisely what Vladimir Putin fears and was one of the principal reasons that he invaded Ukraine, because he didn't want a flourishing capitalistic society on the border of Russia.
Again, I think that's something people often overlook, right? That's exactly right. He could not afford to have a successful, pluralistic, competitive democracy on his borders. It's a terrible advertisement for his regime, especially when it's in Ukraine, which was the old heartland of Imperial Russia.
Let's end by looking at a curious phenomenon. You may remember that Earl Browder was the head of the American Communist Party. And I think it's his grandson then went to Moscow and became a very successful investor, is now living in the UK. And his son, Alexander, is now in the news. His 17-year-old son has been placed on a sanctions list by Russia because he wrote a paper for the Henry M. Jackson Society, which exists in the United Kingdom. And apparently this paper delves into Russia's use of a stable coin to promote criminal activity. What does it say that Russia felt compelled, or Putin felt compelled, to put a teenager on the sanctions list? What does that tell us about Russia?
Well, I think it's a wonderful story. It's a heartwarming story indeed, that this 17-year-old kid could dig up, the goods on Russian nefarious activity overseas. I think it is a very good example of how fragile the Russian system inherently is. Over the years, we've seen what are called open source intelligence communities dig up all kinds of extraordinarily sensitive information about the Russians. Why? Because Russia is very, very corrupt. Everything is available on the black market. These organizations have been able to buy up cell phone lists and, vehicle registrations and all kinds of very useful information that when you, correlate it and put it together, you can actually track the movements of Russian secret police operatives and their doings inside Russia. Absolutely extraordinary, but it's doable if you have the resources and the time, precisely because the Russian system has created all these loopholes that enable people to look in and see what they're doing. Because it is a very chaotic, messy state. I mean, Putin has produced certainly a kind of stability, but there's a fundamental volatility to Russian society he's never been able to completely tame, right? And I, as somebody who lived in Russia for 7 years, not counting another year spent in the former Soviet Union, I have this very strong sense that some of the seams are coming undone, that some things are just not working very well, and that those inherent weaknesses are really starting to manifest themselves in dramatic ways. So I really do feel all bets are off, and again, with my example of East Germany, change does not, it doesn't only, in these authoritarian societies, change doesn't necessarily creep up on you steadily. What happens is you come to a tipping point and the whole thing goes south incredibly quickly, right? That's the thing about the inherent, I think, vulnerability of these states. So it could, Russia could muddle through for another few years. Putin might buy time with a Stalinist crackdown. But I have the sense that, it's getting harder and harder to keep things going as they are. And at some point, they may just hit a wall.
Thank you, Christian.
It's my pleasure.